In this video, I will show you how to evaluate trig expressions such as these using sum and difference formulas. These are the sum and difference formulas we'll be using in addition to the tangent formulas. Okay, so we want to find the sine of 15 degrees, but 15 degrees is not one of the special angles that we have memorized. The special angles are 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees. So we're going to rewrite this. Instead of 15 degrees, we know that 15 degrees is the same as 45 degrees minus 30 degrees. So this would be the same thing as the sine of 45 minus 30. Okay, so looking at the formulas, when you have this, it's going to be sine, cosine, cosine, sine. And if subtraction, it stays subtraction. So sine, cosine, cosine, sine. So this is going to be sine 45 cosine 30 minus cosine 45 sine 30. Now throughout this video, I'm going to be assuming that you have memorized these trig values. So if you have not, please pause the video and memorize this chart right now. So for example, I know that the sine of 45 is radical 2 over 2, and the cosine of 30 is radical 3 over 2, and the cosine of 45 is also radical 2 over 2, and sine of 30 is 1/2. So that's going to make radical 6 over 4 minus radical 2 over 4, which makes radical 6 minus radical 2 over 4. When you're working with radians, it is a little bit different. Here's what I recommend. I'm going to do a little scratch work off to the side here. So I've got 7 pi over 12. I'm going to subtract pi over 4 from this, and you'll see why in a moment. Alright, so I would need like denominators, so I'd have to multiply by 3. Okay, so now 7 pi over 12 minus 3 pi over 12 is going to be 4 pi over 12. That means that 7 pi over 12 minus pi over 4, I just reduced it back down again, is equal to pi over 3. Okay, I just reduced 4 over 12. Adding pi over 4 to both sides gives me 7 pi over 12 equals pi over 4 plus pi over 3. Okay, so this is a substitution that I can do. So instead of writing cosine of 7 pi over 12, this should be the same thing as the cosine of pi over 4 plus pi over 3. Now the cosine sum formula goes cosine, cosine, sine, sine, and it goes from addition to subtraction. So I'm going to do cosine, cosine, sine, sine. So cosine pi over 4 cosine pi over 3 minus sine pi over 4 sine pi over 3. And again, we have memorized these special values. I'm going to be using them now. So cosine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2. Cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. Sine of pi over 4 is radical 2 over 2. And sine of pi over 3 is radical 3 over 2. So this is going to make radical 2 over 4 minus radical 6 over 4. So in the end, we will have radical 2 minus radical 6 over 4. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing with tangent. So I've got pi over 12. So off to the side here, I'm going to say pi over 12, and I'm going to subtract pi over 4. And again, I will need to multiply by 3 on both, numerator, denominator. So this is going to give me 1 pi minus 3 pi. So that's negative 2 pi over 12. Now if I reduce everything back down, I've got pi over 12 minus pi over 4 is equal to negative pi over 6. Adding pi over 4 to both sides gives me pi over 12 is equal to pi over 4 minus pi over 6. So I can make this substitution. So I can write, instead of tangent of pi over 12, this should be the same thing as the tangent of pi over 4 minus pi over 6. Okay, where is that tangent formula? Alright, it goes tangent minus tangent over 1 plus tangent tangent. Okay, so I need to do tangent of pi over 4 minus tangent of pi over 6, and then in the denominator I will do 1 plus tangent tangent. So tangent pi over 4 tangent pi over 6. Okay, and again I have memorized all of these values. So tangent of pi over 4 is 1. Tangent of pi over 6 is radical 3 over 3. Okay, tangent of pi over 4 is 1, but multiplying 1 times whatever this is won't change anything, so I don't need to write down this 1. And again, tangent of pi over 6 is radical 3 over 3. Now the number 1 is a very special number when I'm trying to add or subtract a fraction, because 1 can be rewritten as anything over itself. So in this case I will replace 1 with 3 over 3 so that I have like denominators. Okay, so I'm going to squeeze this in over here. Okay, so that's going to give me 3 minus radical 3 over 3. Alright, that's this numerator right here. And then 3 plus radical 3 over 3. Now, because these both have the same denominator, those are going to wind up canceling each other out. So I'm just going to end up with the leftover numerators. So 3 minus radical 3 over 3 plus radical 3. Kabam! Looking at number 4, remembering that our special angles are 30 degrees, 45 degrees, and 60 degrees, I'm noticing that if I were to add 45 and 60, that would make 105. So this would be the same as having cosine of 45 plus 60. So glancing at the cosine formula, it goes cosine, cosine, sine, sine, and it changes from addition to subtraction. So I'm going to go cosine, cosine, sine, sine. And I'll switch to subtraction. And again, I have memorized all of these trig values. So cosine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. Cosine of 60 is 1/2. Sine of 45 is radical 2 over 2. And sine of 60 is radical 3 over 2. So that is going to give us radical 2 over 4 minus radical 6 over 4. So the final answer is going to be radical 2 minus radical 6 over 4. So number 5 involves radians again, so I'm going to use that trick that I do where I subtract pi over 4 from it. So I'm going to subtract pi over 4, and to do that I need to multiply by 3. So that's going to give me 16 pi over 12. So that means that 19 pi over 12 minus pi over 4 is equal to, and I'm dividing both of these by 4, so that's going to be 4 pi over 3. So that means that 19 pi over 12. Now I'm adding pi over 4 to both sides, so I will get pi over 4 plus 4 pi over 3. So this is now the substitution that I can make instead of 19 pi over 12. So I can write this as the cosine of pi over 4 plus 4 pi over 3. So the cosine formula again goes cosine, cosine, sine, sine, and it switches from addition to subtraction. So I'm going to go cosine, cosine, sine, sine. So cosine pi over 4, cosine 4 pi over 3 minus sine pi over 4 sine 4 pi over 3. Okay, so cosine pi over 4 is right off the chart. It's radical 2 over 2. Now, cosine 4 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3 of course is not on the chart. Pi over 3 is, so I've memorized that the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. So that means that the cosine of 4 pi over 3 is going to either be 1/2 or negative 1/2. All right, in other words, pi over 3 is the reference angle, but it could be negative 1/2. So I have to pay attention to the quadrant. So I'm just going to real quick draw a quick sketch to show you what I'm thinking. So as I'm picturing pi over 3's, all right, here is the unit circle divided up into pi over 3's. 4 pi over 3 is right here. So the only question is cosine positive or negative in this quadrant? Cosine is an x value, which will be negative to the left of the y-axis. So it will in fact be negative 1/2. And then back to business. Sine of pi over 4. That's right off the chart. Now, sine of 4 pi over 3. Well, I feel silly for erasing my little diagram now. The sine of pi over 3, of course, is radical 3 over 2. Whoops. So again, this is either going to be radical... Whoops. I am messing up this evening, folks. So this is either going to be radical 3 over 2, or it will be negative radical 3 over 2. So again, it just all depends on the quadrant. Now, sine is a y value. So 4 pi over 3 is right here. Y values are negative in the third quadrant. So it will in fact be negative radical 3 over 2. So we have negative radical 2 over 4 from this business. Okay. Let's see, how do I exactly want to do this? I guess for now I'll say minus negative radical 6 over 4. But obviously when you subtract a negative, it's going to be positive. So I'm going to end up with negative radical 2 plus radical 6 over 4 for the final answer. Number 6 is going to be very similar. I see the radians, so I'm going to do my radian trick off to the side where I do 13 pi over 12 and I subtract pi over 4, see what I get. I will have to multiply by 3. So that's going to make 10 pi over 12. So that means 13 pi over 12 minus pi over 4 is equal to 5 pi over 6. Adding pi over 4 to both sides gives me 13 pi over 12 equals pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 6. So this is the substitution that I can now make. So this is the same thing as the sine of pi over 4 plus 5 pi over 6. Yeah. Now the sine formula goes sine, cosine, cosine, sine. So I'm going to do sine pi over 4 cosine 5 pi over 6 plus cosine pi over 4 sine 5 pi over 6. So sine of pi over 4 we have memorized is radical 2 over 2. Now I have not memorized the cosine of 5 pi over 6, but I know that the reference angle is pi over 6. So I know that the cosine of pi over 6 is radical 3. Okay, I said radical 3, wrote radical 2. What's going on in my brain? Radical 3 over 2. That's the cosine of pi over 6. That's the reference angle though. So the cosine of 5 pi over 6 will be the same thing, but maybe it's negative radical 3 over 2. I don't know. I have to consider the quadrant for that. So in my mind, this is what I'm thinking. The reference angle is pi over 6. So I know that 6 pi over 6 is the same thing as pi. So 5 pi over 6 would be 1 less than that. So that would put 5 pi over 6 here in the second quadrant, where cosine is negative because it's an x value, and this is to the left. Okay, so that's why I know it will in fact be negative radical 3 over 2. Okay, moving on. Cosine of pi over 4 we have memorized is radical 2 over 2. And again, I have not memorized the sine of 5 pi over 6. But I have memorized the sine of pi over 6, which is 1/2. So maybe it's going to be negative 1/2. So I need to look at the quadrant. And again, in the second quadrant, sine is going to be positive. So I'm going to leave it positive 1/2 because sine is a y value, and y values are positive in the second quadrant. So this is what I have. So I'm going to have negative radical 6 over 4 plus radical 2 over 4. So that gives me negative radical 6 plus radical 2 over 4 for my final answer. Alright guys, that's going to do it for this video. Go ahead and click here in the red apple to watch the next video. Click in the green apple to subscribe, or click the yellow apple for the full playlist.